going? Today we are going to have our segment on utilitarianism, and our primary text is Mill's text, Utilitarianism. I think it's written in 1863, but Mill offers a very important social philosophy that is still relevant today. And so we have three goals today, one of which is to figure out what is Mill and how does he fit into the history of philosophy? Also, how does Mill's ethics vary from Kant's? So if you remember last time, we checked out Immanuel Kant, who emphasizes motives as the basis of being correct ethics, right? Kant says that you need to have the right motive, otherwise you can't do good ethics without the right motive. And Kant goes so far as to say, as long as you're consistent and you have the right motive with the categorical imperative, it doesn't matter what the consequences are. What a strange claim. Here you have a philosopher, Kant, who's telling us the consequences don't matter. Well, at this late date, maybe the consequences are one of the most important things that matters, and that's what Mill is up to. So, sometimes utilitarianism is called social consequentialism, and it's measured in terms of consequences. So you'll see this thing called the pleasure-pain calculus. Calculus without numbers. In a way, there are kind of like numbers, but what he purports he's doing is he's trying to evaluate actions according to the utility calculus. And the utility calculus measures happiness versus unhappiness for the greatest number of persons, right? So one of the things utilitarianism is really good at is thinking about the common good, right? So if you have, say, an action that influences the common good very negatively, that's bad according to utilitarianism. So one example, this might be the Exxon Valdez oil spill, right? So the Exxon Valdez spilled millions of gallons of oil into the ocean off the coast of Alaska. Now, if you live near the coast of Alaska, probably a lot of the jobs in that community or series of communities, probably a lot of them have to do with the fishing industry, right? And if you have millions of gallons of oil spilled into the ocean, probably, it's aesthetically bad and nasty for the environment, but it's also bad for everyone's livelihoods, right? Because there's probably a lot of jobs and people can no longer feed themselves. So that something like that, an accident, even if the person who spilled all this oil didn't mean any harm, it created really bad consequences. And consequences are the thing to focus in on. So Mill remarks that his theory is Epicureanism. And earlier in the 19th century, there's another utilitarian philosopher who also is in the Epicurean lineage. And his name is Jeremy Bentham. So I'd like to return to Bentham momentarily. But in the ancient world, Epicureans were attacked because of their view of what the nature of the good life is. So they don't have a sophisticated concept of virtue like Aristotle might offer us, but rather they say, look, what you need to do, Epicurus, is a hedonist, and hedonism is the position that claims that people by nature seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's psychological hedonism. The philosophical hedonism is that's what people should do. They should seek pleasure and avoid pain, right? So in the ancient world, many intellectual elites say, what is the meaning of the good life? We're supposed to just listen to reggae music and hang around, get massages and drink cocktails on the beach. Maybe it's not inconsistent with that position, but there's this idea that it's not a very sophisticated concept of the meaning of a good life for a human being. And so one of the criticisms of Epicureanism in the ancient and in the modern world is the doctrine of swine. A swine is a pig, right? And so one of the things that Mill wants to defend is the idea that there are some pleasures that are better than others. But in general, pleasure is good. And this particular philosophy frames the utility calculus according to this criterion that actions are good, and laws too. So if you want to make good laws, you want to consider the types of consequences they have, right? So actions and laws are good insofar as they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? So basically what he's trying to do is he's trying to figure out how to minimize pain and suffering for people and create happiness. So, I mean, it's one good thing about utilitarianism is it's very accessible as an ethical theory, and many people probably intuitively gravitate toward utilitarianism. So if you ever consider those arguments with, a trolley's coming and one person's going to, 10 people are going to get killed unless you flip the switch, right? And you flip the switch and kill one person, right? Because you divert the trolley to kill one person instead of 10. If you do nothing, 10 people are going to get killed, right? So this is a kind of utility calculus, right? With the idea being, well, you want to maximize happiness for the greatest number. You don't want 10 people to die. But if you do nothing, 10 people are going to die. So you flip the switch. Are you killing that one person to save the other 10 people? So utilitarianism is good at trying to weigh out the relative good and bad in any ethical equation. But the good and the bad are measured in terms of happiness or pain, right? So one of the criticisms of this movement, right, Epicurus is an ancient philosopher who claims the soul dies with the body. Doctrine of swine, godless philosophy. And one of the things Mill tries to do is defend utilitarianism against the claim that it's godless, right? So he says, think about Jesus of Nazareth, for example. Jesus of Nazareth has this rule, the golden rule. And you find this in Confucius and also in some Buddhism and other texts as well, that, you want to consider do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. There's a positive and a negative formulation of that. Sometimes it says don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. But if you live in a society that promotes that kind of rule, that society, when you consider other people's perspective and whether you cause them pain, if you adopt that rule, it's probably going to be a society where there's more collective happiness and less pain, right? So one of the things that he's trying to suggest is utilitarianism is consistent with a religious perspective. He even goes so far as to say, well, if God wants his creatures to be happy, then utilitarianism is the most religious doctrine of them all, right? So Mill is in some ways bulletproof against some of these reproaches. But one final thing worth considering. The earlier 19th century philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, when asked, well, what kind of pleasures should we pursue, Jeremy? Jeremy Bentham says, pushpin is as good as poetry. And pushpin is a kind of kids game, so it doesn't matter, just seek pleasure. But Mill has a more nuanced account of this. He says some pleasures are better than other pleasures. And he says, look, if you consult people who are experts in pleasure, that is, people who've experienced every type of pleasure that can be experienced, he says, almost no one would consent to have themselves turned into a beast. And so he says, I'd rather be Socrates on a bad day than the most happy pig of them all, right? And so what he's trying to do is he's saying all Epicurean theories of life have always esteemed a certain order of pleasure that, and so there's a gradation of pleasures, right? So if you go to the movies, you might eat chocolate or popcorn, and that's a sensory pleasure. But your ability to understand and enjoy the movie depends upon your faculties, right? So that's a different type of pleasure that is related to the pursuit of human happiness for John Stuart Mill. Okay, so If you have any questions about utilitarianism, feel free to hit me up with an email, and I hope you stay healthy, smart, and strong.